Good morning, everyone. Once again, we want to thank you for listening to another lesson from the Spearsville Road Church of Christ in Trafalgar, Indiana. My name is Charles Wright. I'm the evangelist for the Spearsville Road Church of Christ. We want to begin today, as well as also on Sundays, a lesson dealing with 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. We want to start looking at 1st Thessalonians in a verse-by-verse sort of way, and as a result of such, develop a better understanding of the passages there and the importance of the lesson that is taught there. You know, a wonderful hope of the Christian is the fact of the promise that Jesus one day will return. A promise was given when Jesus ascended into heaven in Acts 1, verses 9 through 11, when he said, "And when he had said these things as they were looking on, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of the sight. And while they were gazing into heaven as he went, behold, two men stood by them in white robes, and said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? This Jesus, who was taken up from you into heaven, will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven." And then also a promise was designed to motivate Christians to live a holy and a godly life in 2 Peter chapter 3, beginning with verse 10, where there he says, "But the day of the Lord will come as a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. Since all these things," he says, "are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be? In lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. But according to the promise, we are waiting for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Therefore, beloved," he says here, "you are waiting for these. Be diligent and be found by him without spot or blemish, but at peace." And so again, we want to notice what Thessalonians has to say concerning this. How then should we live? How should we live as we anticipate the fact that Jesus one day is going to return? And that question is really addressed in Paul's first epistle to the Thessalonians. Every chapter of 1 Thessalonians has some mention of the Lord's return. Every chapter talks about practical instructions for holy and for godly living. And so that we might be ready for the Lord's return, we want to begin these series of lessons talking about 1 Thessalonians. And in this lesson, we want to look at simply some background information on this particular epistle. Let's talk first of all, as 1 Thessalonians tells us, that the author of this particular epistle is Paul. Paul clearly recognizes himself as such, and he writes as such that he was simply known formerly as Saul of Tarsus, a persecutor of the church, as Acts 9 tells us. He became known as the apostle to the Gentiles, as Acts 9 and verse 15 says. Probably half of the books of the New Testament was authored by Paul. But he was joined here, as it says in 1 Thessalonians 1 and verse 1, by Silvanus and Timothy. Silvanus is also known in the New Testament as Silas. He was originally a missionary from the apostles and elders in Jerusalem. He was identified as a prophet who exhorted the brethren in Antioch. He remained in Antioch and later became Paul's traveling companion. He suffered mistreatment, though, and imprisonment with Paul at Philippi. And together with Paul, he established that church in Thessalonica. And so in Acts chapters 15, 16, and 17, you can read a little bit more about Silvanus there, or Silas. Timothy also, who's known as Timotheus, was a young disciple who simply traveled with Paul. He's mentioned in many of Paul's letters. He was a recipient, actually, of two of the letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and he suffered imprisonment himself, but yet he later returned from a trip, or just had returned from a trip to Thessalonica, and let Paul know what's happening there. And so these three men had a vested interest in the welfare of the church at Thessalonica, and they were speaking of that church. And so let's now focus on who were the recipients. Who were the recipients of this epistle? What do we know about the city of Thessalonica? Well, it was the capital. It was the largest city of the Roman province of Macedonia. It was located on the Egnatian Way, which was a major road from Rome to all of the eastern provinces. The city served as a center of trade as well as also commerce. The church at of the Thessalonians was established in Acts chapter 17. Acts 17 verses 1 through 9. There the apostle Paul talks about the fact of his companions on that second journey had just left Philippi, and he was traveling through some areas, and he finally arrived at Thessalonica. And the Apostle Paul immediately located the synagogue that was there, and he used their Sabbath gathering as an opportunity for evangelism. And for 3 weeks, the passage tells us that he reasoned with the Jews, converting some, as well as also a number of prominent Gentiles also. There were unbelieving Jews who soon, though, caused a great disturbance. And so it forced Paul to have to leave that particular city. And in spite of these ominous beginnings, a strong congregation was established there. And it quickly gained a great reputation, as verse 8 says of 1 Thessalonians 1, "For not only has the word of the Lord sounded forth from you in Macedonia and Achaia, but your faith has gone forth everywhere, so that we need not say anything." It was mostly made up of Gentiles, as verse 9 of 1 Thessalonians 1 tells us. Some of those members is mentioned in Acts 17 and Acts 20. And so again, the reputation of this church is even more remarkable when we consider really just how young it was. It was a young congregation. The young age of this church becomes apparent when we consider the place as well as the date of the writing of this. This letter itself indicates that it was written simply long after Paul's departure. Or not long, it was not written, I should say, long after Paul's departure. Paul had only been gone just a short time as it was. He had sent Timothy from Athens, who returned, as 1 Thessalonians 3 will tell us. And so from Luke's record in Asia, it is evident that Paul wrote this epistle soon after arriving simply in Corinth on his second missionary journey. Paul did not stay long in Athens, and Timothy came from Macedonia after Paul arrived in Corinth. So the place of the writing of this letter is most likely probably the city of Corinth. The date of the writing is soon after his arrival in Corinth. This would place the date at somewhere between 50 and 52 AD. And so this would probably make 1 Thessalonians one of Paul's earliest known writings, if not probably the first writing that the Apostle Paul did. What was the purpose? What's the content of this epistle that we'll find here? Paul had been anxious, apparently, about the condition of the church there. Again, it had an abrupt, very departure by himself, and he wanted to return, but because of many things, he was hindered from doing such. And so his anxiety prompted him to send Timothy to encourage them, to be with them. And Timothy came back and brought back to him a great report. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, beginning with verse 6, it says, "But now that Timothy has come to us from you and has brought us the good news of your faith and your love, and reported that you always remember us kindly and long to see us as we long to see you. For this reason, brothers, in all of our distress and affliction, we have been comforted about your faith and again through your faith. For now we live if we are standing fast in the Lord." And so here Timothy brought back good news. He brought back news about their faith, about their love, of their desire to simply see Paul again. He talked about their steadfastness. And this is what comforted the Apostle Paul greatly. And so from the content of this letter, it becomes apparent that Paul really had a threefold purpose. It seems like a threefold purpose in mind as he wrote this letter. First of all, to praise them for their steadfastness under persecution, to instruct them concerning living a holy life, to correct any misunderstanding, especially regarding the second coming of Christ. And so what we find here is an epistle that is every chapter, as we mentioned, ends with a reference to the second coming of Christ. And so again, a brief outline of this is in chapters 1 through 3. The Apostle Paul has some personal reflections about simply the church there regarding their condition, their conduct, and his concern simply for them. But then he gives them finally in chapters 4 and 5, some instructions as an apostle to walk in holiness, to walk in love, to walk in diligence, to walk in hope, to walk in light, to walk in obedience. And so with this emphasis on steadfastness, with this emphasis on holy living, an appropriate theme for this epistle would be holiness. Holiness in view of the coming of Christ. And so in keeping with such theme, I offer the following passage as probably the key verse of this epistle. And this is in 1 Thessalonians 3. 1 Thessalonians 3, verses 12 and 13, he says, "And may the Lord make you increase and abound in love to one another and to all, just as we do to you, so that he may establish your hearts blameless in holiness before our God and Father at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ with all of his saints." And so as we proceed for the next several weeks through this epistle, it is my prayer as well as my aim of this particular study that it'll lead us to a greater faithfulness. It'll lead us to a greater holiness in our service to God as we simply wait for the coming of Jesus. I ask you this evening or this morning, are you ready? Are you ready for his coming? Even if you should die before he returns, are you ready to face him on that day of judgment? Let the apostles of Christ, again, tell you the importance of the need to be ready for this particular day in which such will come about. And only then can it be said, as 1 Thessalonians 1 and verse 1 says, "Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ." Again, we're thankful for those of you who've been listening to this program. We're thankful for the remarks and comments that's been made to us as a result of this lesson. We continue to we'll be doing these lessons on Sundays and on Wednesdays, and so we continue to invite you to listen to these messages. Again, we hope that all is well with your family, both physically as well as spiritually, and so as a result of such, we bid you Godspeed.